In the gilded halls of Versailles, where once golden mirrors captured the splendor of absolute monarchy, a far darker reflection emerged by 1774, one of corruption, decay, and raw human fragility. The king who had entered history as Louis the Well-Beloved would leave it as Louis the Hated, his body devoured not only by disease but by the very toxins of his own rule. This is the tale of how one man's moral decay expressed itself in the physical annihilation of his flesh, and how his putrefying corpse became the ultimate emblem of a monarchy already eating itself alive from the inside. Louis XV's reign remains one of history's most spectacular falls from grace, a grim warning about power without restraint and duty forsaken. When smallpox finally seized him in May 1774, it did so with a savagery that drove even his most devoted servants away from the reek of his rotting body. Yet that ghastly death was only the closing scene of a tragedy that had unfolded across decades and would soon help ignite one of history's bloodiest revolutions. To grasp the full terror of Louis XV's end, we must first trace how France's most hopeful young king became its most reviled tyrant. His story does not open with the corrupt monarch gasping on a stinking deathbed, but with a 5-year-old orphan suddenly placed upon the throne of Europe's mightiest kingdom. The stark difference between that innocent child king and the diseased despot he became lays bare the total moral and physical collapse that defined his rule. The year 1715 was both an end and a beginning. Louis XIV, the Sun King who had reigned an astonishing 72 years, at last died, leaving a legacy of absolute dominion and crippling debt. His chosen successor, his 5-year-old great-grandson, Louis XV, inherited not merely a crown but the crushing expectations of a nation that had known only one ruler for almost 3/4 of a century. The boy who would be king had already lost both parents to illness. During his minority, France was ruled by a regency led by Philippe d'Orléans, a time of relative liberalism and slow economic healing after the ruinous wars of Louis XIV. The young Louis received the finest education possible: languages, history, mathematics, warfare, diplomacy. His tutors praised his keen mind and saw in him the makings of a great ruler. Across France, people gazed at their child king with genuine hope, dreaming of a new golden age. When Louis XV began ruling in his own name in 1723, the French people truly adored him. Handsome, clever, and radiating renewal after the stiff final years of the Sun King, he earned the title, Louis the Well-Beloved, not as irony but as heartfelt affection. Citizens everywhere saw in their young monarch the promise of reform, prosperity, and wiser governance. Those early years seemed to fulfill that promise. He married Marie Leszczyńska, daughter of Poland's deposed king. In a wedding that reaffirmed French dominance, the queen swiftly bore heirs. Louis patronized science, philosophy, and the arts while keeping France the cultural heart of Europe. Yet even in those bright beginnings, subtle cracks appeared. Louis XV showed chronic indecision and a growing habit of leaning on favorites and mistresses for counsel. Where Louis XIV had projected divine authority and iron self-control, his great-grandson appeared far more drawn to pleasure than to the burdens of power. The court slowly gained a reputation for libertinage that would only worsen with time. The shift from beloved to despised happened gradually, through accumulating scandals, disasters, and misjudgments that steadily destroyed public trust. Each crisis exposed the king's inability to give France the firm leadership it needed. What started as a reign rich with possibility slid into a nightmare of military humiliation, financial collapse, and moral rot that would swallow the king himself and, eventually, the monarchy entire. The first great trial came with the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748. France joined chiefly to curb Britain and back its old ally Prussia, but the conflict instantly revealed the weaknesses that would dog Louis XV's armies for decades. Unlike the meticulous campaigns of Louis XIV, these wars lacked clear goals or strategy, mirroring the king's own hesitation and the chaos inside his government. The cost was astronomical. New taxes and loans drove the nation deeper into debt. Once terrifying French armies suffered shameful defeats and lost key territories. Though Louis briefly won applause by leading troops in person, his battlefield decisions were too often swayed by court gossip and personal ties rather than strategy. Meanwhile, his marriage cooled as he took a string of mistresses, the most important being Madame de Pompadour, who became not only lover but chief political advisor. The arrangement outraged court and country alike, proof to many of the king's moral failure and dreadful judgment. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 returned almost everything to the status quo despite France's immense sacrifice. Ordinary Frenchmen felt their sons had died and their taxes vanished for nothing. Well-beloved began to sound like a cruel joke. Louis XV reacted to the criticism by retreating deeper into Versailles, surrounding himself with yes-men, growing ever more detached from his people's real suffering. Throughout the 1750s the chasm widened between palace luxury and national misery. Tales, often exaggerated but grounded in truth, of lavish gifts to mistresses and the building of the Petit Trianon for Pompadour's private pleasure dome, spread like wildfire and stoked resentment. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, proved an even greater catastrophe. France lost almost its entire North American empire, Canada, Louisiana, most of India, to Britain in a humiliation the nation never forgave Louis XV for. Taxes soared, falling heaviest on commoners while nobles and clergy kept their exemptions. By the Treaty of Paris in 1763 France was stripped of global power and reduced to a second-rate state. The king who had once symbolized renewal now embodied defeat. After 1763 Louis withdrew further into hunting, mistresses, and empty ritual while France staggered under problems that cried out for decisive leadership. Pompadour, until her death in 1764, and later the low-born, openly mercenary Madame du Barry wielded real political power, handing out offices to their friends and further convincing every class that the regime was rotten. Religious quarrels, the expulsion of the Jesuits, the king's flagrant immorality, alienated devout Catholics who had once seen the monarch as eldest son of the church. Enlightenment writers, Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, attacked the very idea of divine right absolutism, and Louis XV's conduct supplied them perfect examples. Censorship only made forbidden books more desirable. Food shortages sparked riots, the government answered with troops rather than reform. By the late 1760s the monarchy had lost legitimacy in the eyes of most Frenchmen. The 1770s opened with debt at catastrophic levels, poor harvests, bread riots, and a court extravagance more obscene than ever, and Madame du Barry still lording over policy. Enlightenment ideas spread downward, satirical songs and pamphlets mocked the king as a debauched weakling. International prestige sank lower still. Louis XV, now visibly aged and weary, carried on hunting and ceremonials as if nothing were wrong. In April 1774, while staying at the Petit Trianon with du Barry, he fell ill. Headache, fever, fatigue, doctors blamed overwork. Days later the telltale pox of smallpox appeared. Panic gripped Versailles. Courtiers and servants fled, even doctors could barely stay in the room. The disease ran an especially vicious course. Within days the handsome king was unrecognizable, skin blackening, pustules bursting, the stench unbearable. Mirrors were removed so he would not see himself. Etiquette collapsed, du Barry was banished. Alone with a handful of reluctant attendants, Louis XV endured almost 2 weeks of agony, sometimes lucid and repentant, more often delirious. On May 10, 1774 he died in torment. Paris greeted the news with cheers, church bells stayed silent. The body, too corrupted for normal embalming, was hastily sealed in lead and rushed to St. Denis without lying in state or proper ceremony, an event that felt less like a royal funeral than the disposal of hazardous remains. Contemporary chroniclers saw perfect symbolism. The king's physical rot mirrored the moral rot of his reign. The magnificent funeral of Louis XIV stood in humiliating contrast to this hurried, stinking burial. Louis XVI, aged 20 and unprepared, inherited a bankrupt, resentful, and ungovernable kingdom. The horrors of Louis XV's death stripped away the last illusions of divine kingship. A monarch had died like any commoner, worse than most, abandoned, reviled, his flesh disintegrating while still alive. That image became revolutionary propaganda gold, proof the entire system was diseased beyond cure. His reign had shown that absolute power without accountability eventually destroys itself. The child who had once carried all of France's hopes died as the men who made revolution inevitable, his putrid corpse the perfect emblem of a monarchy already dead inside, waiting only for the final blow that would come 15 years later.